Hey everyone, my name is Dr. Tanisha Guy and I'm a licensed professional counselor. So I've been in private practice now for 10 years, but I've been practicing in the mental health field now for almost 2 decades. And this week I had a session and something that was stated in the session resonated with me as it relates to compatibility or how we meet people and why we stay in a relationship with that particular person. And so the topic was about soulmates. I would imagine that if I did a poll and asked 100 people if they believed in soulmates, I might get 50% that would say absolutely. Another 50% would probably say, no, I don't think so. But regardless of one's belief about the idea behind a soulmate, what I seem to find in practice and personal life and when it comes to relationships with people is that I don't think people are finding their soulmates. In fact, I think people are finding the very opposite. What I believe they're finding is their trauma mates. And just like soulmates, they're drawn to this particular person for a specific reason. And they're drawn together like magnets. And it's not because they have chemistry or because they're compatible, but what draws them to each other is their trauma. And unfortunately, I don't think that when this is happening that people are fully aware that they're drawn to this other person because they share this common bond, but the common bond that they share is trauma. And so when you have two people that are sharing a common bond and the bond that relates them is trauma, it typically leads to toxic relationships. And so I want to talk about 3 things that I believe are indicators that potentially you might be in a trauma mate relationship with someone who's not your soulmate. So the first thing that I've noticed, and there seems to be a commonality, and it doesn't matter what the gender or what the race is, it doesn't matter the ages of these individuals in the relationships. The common themes are these 3. And so the first one that seems to come up is that these individuals have some type of issues with abandonment or being alone or left alone or feeling lonely. And even though those all share some similarities, they're quite different. And what I mean by that is you could be in a room filled with people, or you could live in a house with multiple people and still feel alone. And that's slightly different than someone who has issues with being left alone because of some past experience that resulted in them feeling abandoned. And so there's this common thread of fear to leave the relationship on their own, or the fear that the person that they're in a relationship with is going to leave them, that stems back to these feelings of loneliness or abandonment. The second thing that seems to come up in these relationships is this idea that they either consciously or unconsciously are aware of. And this is the one that's very difficult for most people to talk about. It's their own feelings of self-worth, or lack of self-worth for that matter. And so oftentimes in sessions, these individuals will describe themselves as being less than, or use goods, or not see themselves as worthy enough to be in potentially another relationship. And so they stay in the relationship that they're in. And this one isn't always conscious, right? Sometimes people will come into session and they'll say, oh no, I love myself and I'm so happy with who I am and love everything about myself. Okay. Really? Have you looked at your relationship? Like, this is an example of 2 things that really can't occupy the same space. And that's to say that I completely, absolutely value my self-worth, but I'm in a toxic relationship that's not healthy. Like, you might have felt that way. You might even want to feel that way. But to say that that's how you feel it's kind of hard to support that when you're in a relationship that doesn't grow you. In fact, it does the total opposite. Everything about the relationship breaks you and tears you down. And so that's the second commonality that seems to come up in these trauma mate relationships. And then the third one is obviously trauma. So whether people talk about it in their adult lives or not, when we experience these early childhood traumas and they're not addressed or we don't deal with them, and now we're adults, oftentimes we re-experience the trauma with the individuals that are in our current lives. And it doesn't matter what the trauma was, whether it was sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse, doesn't matter. Whatever that trauma was, whether it was them observing or seeing a parent being abused, doesn't matter how they define the trauma. The trauma is still being relived in their adult experiences, in their romantic relationships, and often we even see this in their platonic relationships. So one of the patterns that becomes noticeable is that however that person experienced their trauma as a child and they dealt with it, typically becomes the same way they experienced the trauma as an adult. So what do I mean by that? If at a young age someone experienced something that was traumatic, male or female, and let's say the age was 7. At 7, this particular child learned that my response to this is to be angry, because I'm angry that it happened to me. I'm angry that no one protected me. I'm angry that no one knows about this. I'm angry that maybe it continued to go on. So what you begin to see in this child, male or female, is the presentation of anger and frustration. And so the way they deal and interact with people is through defensiveness, aggressiveness, whether it's verbally or physically, and just intense anger. The second type that you see when someone has experienced a traumatic event is to do the complete opposite. This person retracts, they internalize things that they are experiencing, they isolate themselves, they disconnect from the experience that took place, which was so traumatic. And so now in their adult relationships, they show up the same way. They show up as being disconnected, isolated. They have difficult times connecting to people, and oftentimes may even become overly emotional as a response to anything that's happening in their relationship. And that's because as a result of that early childhood trauma, this was their response to it. It was, I don't know how to deal with it, whether it's because it happened at such a young age or because I just don't know how to deal with this particular trauma. Internally, I'm going to internalize this and take it on as it was my fault. If I didn't do this, if I wasn't here, if I didn't wear this, if I didn't say this, then these things wouldn't have happened to me. And so all of the trauma becomes about them, right? And so as a result, that creates these intense emotions, because now I feel really disconnected because I caused that pain that I experienced. And so it becomes painful. So what you begin to see is this outward expression of emotion. Well, in their adult relationships, they exhibit the same types of behavior, and it's resulting from unresolved childhood traumas. So these individuals are drawn to each other like magnets. And again, it doesn't matter whether we're talking about a male or a female, the commonalities are the same. It's the issues of abandonment or the fear of being abandoned. It's the feeling of just not being worthy enough or good enough or being used goods. And the third one is the inability to deal with unresolved childhood traumas. Because of these top 3 things, I do believe that individuals continue to find people that they're in relationships with that are just toxic and not healthy. And as a result, they're drawn to these trauma mates. And not only are they drawn to these trauma mates, but they stay in these trauma mate relationships. And so I can guarantee that every single person who is watching this video, you either know somebody or you've been the person who stayed in a relationship way too long. Your mama told you, your daddy told you, your friends told you, your relatives told you, and heck, in some cases, your therapist even told you. This relationship is toxic, and yet you stayed. And really can't even put your finger on the reason why you stayed. I mean, you may have called it love or a soulmate that you found or whatever the other irrational beliefs that we come up with that keeps us in these unhealthy relationships. You said it. But the reality possibly is you stayed in that relationship because you were tied and connected to the trauma that your mate had experienced. And why would you say this person stayed? Because it's familiar. Because you know it. Right? You know what that feels like. And even though it's uncomfortable and you dislike it and it causes pain, it's familiar. And both parties do the same thing. The male is experiencing the same type of response from his partner, but yet he stays in a toxic relationship knowing that he probably should leave it, but he doesn't, because again, he's with his trauma mate, not really knowing that he has these unresolved issues of trauma himself. And they look very differently for each person, but they carry these commonalities that they share, and they keep people in these unhealthy relationships. Like, I am so amazed at how many people come into therapy and they are so unhappy, but they know how to not be unhappy, but they won't do what needs to be done. And oftentimes it's leaving the person they're in a relationship with. Now, yes, there are some other factors that people take into consideration, like the fact that they're raising kids together or financially it's not a good decision. All those things, absolutely. But at the end of the day, if you're in a relationship and it is not growing you and that mate is not supporting you and it does the total opposite, it literally feels like it is draining your life force every single day you stay in it, but you stay, it is a possibility that you're in a trauma mate relationship. So if you think or you know somebody who might be in a trauma mate relationship, calling it their soulmate, ask them these 3 things. Is there a fear of abandonment? Do you deal with feelings of isolation or fear of loneliness, or do you feel alone? Do you question your own worth? Do you not feel valued? Do you not feel good enough? Do you not feel worthy enough to be in a better, healthier relationship? And the third one, do you possibly have some unresolved childhood traumas that you just haven't dealt with? And you think by not talking about it, by not thinking about it, it makes them go away. The reality is that's false. There's so many people that are in so many unhealthy relationships and they just don't know how to get out. And for some, they don't even realize why they're in them. Possibly it's because they're reliving their trauma through being with their trauma mate. You guys, if you haven't already done so, don't forget to subscribe to my channel.